In the winter of 1855, the entire Kellerman family, Heinrich, his wife Martha, and their 4 children disappeared without a trace from their coal mine in the Kentucky Highlands. The official report claimed a catastrophic mine collapse had buried them all. Yet no bodies were ever recovered. For over 3 decades, the people of Harlan County accepted this tragic explanation until a dying man's confession in 1889 revealed a conspiracy so shocking it would expose the dark birth of corporate America's most ruthless practices. What really happened to the Kellermans wasn't an accident. It was cold-blooded murder disguised as industrial tragedy, orchestrated by men who valued coal more than human life. Before we continue with the story of the Kellerman family and their doomed discovery in the Kentucky mountains, if you're fascinated by hidden chapters of American history like this one, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We uncover these forgotten mysteries every week, and tell us in the comments what state are you listening from. We love hearing from viewers across the country who share our passion for America's darkest secrets. The truth about what befell the Kellermans begins not with their disappearance, but with their remarkable discovery just months before, a discovery that would seal their fate and expose the ruthless appetite of America's emerging industrial giants. The Kentucky Highlands of 1855 were a world apart from the bustling cities of the East. Nestled in the Appalachian Mountains, small communities like Pine Ridge existed in relative isolation, where families carved out modest livings from the unforgiving terrain. The region's economy had long depended on subsistence farming and small-scale logging, but whispers of coal beneath the mountains were beginning to change everything. Heinrich Kellerman had arrived in Kentucky 7 years earlier, part of the wave of German immigrants seeking opportunity in America's expanding frontier. Unlike many of his countrymen who settled in cities, Heinrich was drawn to the mountains, where his knowledge of mining, learned in the coal fields of the Ruhr Valley, might prove valuable. He purchased 43 acres of seemingly worthless rocky hillside for the modest sum of $87, much to the amusement of local residents who considered the land too poor even for grazing. Heinrich's wife Martha, a sturdy woman with calloused hands and intelligent brown eyes, had supported their move with characteristic determination. Their children, Johann, 16, Maria, 14, young Wilhelm, 11, and baby Elizabeth, barely 3, had adapted to mountain life with the resilience of youth. The family spoke German at home, but English in town, straddling 2 worlds as they worked to establish themselves in their adopted country. By the autumn of 1854, Heinrich had begun preliminary excavations on his property, following veins of coal that seemed to run deeper and richer than anything he had encountered in Germany. Word of his early success spread quickly through Pine Ridge, and soon neighbors were speaking in hushed tones about the Kellerman luck. But it was in February of 1855 that Heinrich made a discovery that would change everything and ultimately destroy his family. Working alone in the early morning hours, Heinrich broke through into what appeared to be a natural cavern. What he found there took his breath away, the largest, purest vein of coal he had ever seen, stretching deeper into the mountain than his lamplight could penetrate. Conservative estimates suggested enough high-quality coal to supply Louisville's growing industrial needs for decades. Heinrich Kellerman, the German immigrant who had bought worthless land, had stumbled upon what would later be valued at over $200,000, a fortune that would make him one of the wealthiest men in Kentucky. News of Heinrich's extraordinary discovery reached Louisville within a week, carried by a traveling merchant who had witnessed wagons of unusually fine coal leaving the Kellerman property in the marble-columned offices of the Cumberland Coal and Rail Company. This intelligence was received with intense interest and growing alarm. Jeremiah Whitlock, the company's managing director, had spent 2 years methodically acquiring mineral rights throughout Harlan County, using a combination of legal maneuvering, political pressure, and, when necessary, intimidation. His operation was part of a larger strategy to monopolize Kentucky's coal resources as the nation's appetite for fuel grew insatiable. The railroad boom, expanding factories, and America's rapid industrialization had made coal the new gold, and men like Whitlock intended to control every ounce of it. The Kellerman property represented a critical gap in Whitlock's empire. His geological surveys had identified the area as potentially rich in coal, but Heinrich's immigrant status and the small size of his holding had made him appear insignificant until now. The discovery of what appeared to be the richest vein in the region threatened to upset carefully laid plans and cost the company millions in potential profits. On March 15, 1855, Whitlock dispatched his most trusted agent, a cold-eyed man named Samuel Briggs, to negotiate with Heinrich Kellerman. Briggs arrived in Pine Ridge with an offer that he considered generous, $1,500 for the Kellerman property, nearly 20 times what Heinrich had originally paid. To Briggs, it seemed like easy money for a simple German farmer. Heinrich's response was polite, but firm. He thanked Briggs for the offer, but explained that he had no intention of selling. The mine represented his family's future in America, a legacy he could pass to his children and their children after them. Moreover, Heinrich had done his calculations. His coal was worth far more than $1,500, perhaps 50 times that amount or more. Briggs increased his offer to $3,000, then $5,000, his patience wearing thin with each rejection. When Heinrich continued to refuse, Briggs's demeanor shifted from persuasive to threatening. He spoke of the dangers of mining, of accidents that befell families who lacked proper backing and protection. He mentioned how isolated the Kellerman property was, how easily things could go wrong for people who didn't have powerful friends. Heinrich, whose experience in Germany had taught him to recognize threats disguised as warnings, ordered Briggs off his property. As the agent departed, he called back over his shoulder, "Think carefully about your decision, Mr. Kellerman. The mountains of Kentucky can be very dangerous for those who don't know their place." That evening, Heinrich gathered his family around their modest dinner table and spoke to them in German, his voice heavy with concern. He had recognized something in Briggs's eyes, a coldness that reminded him of the industrial bosses he had fled in the old country. Men who viewed workers as expendable resources. Martha listened quietly, her expression growing more troubled as Heinrich described the encounter, and his growing suspicion that their discovery had marked them for danger. The weeks following Briggs's visit brought an escalating campaign of intimidation against the Kellerman family. Their mail delivery became sporadic, then stopped entirely. Local merchants, previously friendly, became distant and reluctant to extend credit. Most disturbing of all, Heinrich began to notice strangers watching their property from the surrounding hills, men who disappeared whenever he tried to approach them. In Louisville, Jeremiah Whitlock was implementing a strategy he had used successfully against stubborn landowners throughout Kentucky. First came economic pressure. The Cumberland Coal and Rail Company used its influence with banks, suppliers, and local officials to isolate the Kellermans financially. Then came legal harassment. Spurious claims were filed questioning the validity of Heinrich's land purchase, forcing him to spend precious resources on lawyers and court fees. But Heinrich proved more resilient than Whitlock had anticipated. The German immigrant had documented every aspect of his land purchase meticulously, and his legal position was unassailable. More frustratingly for Whitlock, Heinrich had begun negotiating directly with coal dealers from Cincinnati and Nashville, bypassing Louisville entirely and commanding premium prices for his superior product. By November of 1855, the Cumberland Coal and Rail Company was facing a crisis. Heinrich's independent operation was not only costing them potential profits, but also inspiring other small landowners to resist the company's buyout offers. Word was spreading throughout the Kentucky coal regions that a simple immigrant had defied the powerful corporation and won. Whitlock's carefully constructed monopoly was beginning to unravel. The solution, when it came, was suggested by Samuel Briggs during a private meeting in Whitlock's office on a cold December evening. Briggs had spent months studying the Kellerman operation, noting its isolation, the family's work patterns, and the layout of their mine. He presented his employer with what he called a permanent solution to our Kentucky problem. The plan was diabolical in its simplicity. The Kellermans worked their mine during the harshest winter months when surface farming was impossible. They typically entered the mine before dawn and worked until late evening, the entire family contributing to the operation. An accident during the winter months would be easily explained. Mines were dangerous places, and immigrant families often lacked proper safety procedures. Whitlock initially hesitated, understanding the implications of what Briggs was suggesting, but the potential profits were too great and the threat to his empire too serious. The Kentucky coal industry was worth millions, and the Kellermans had made themselves an obstacle to progress. In the ruthless calculus of America's Gilded Age capitalism, 5 lives weighed little against such vast economic interests. The final decision was made on December 10, 1855. Whitlock authorized Briggs to proceed with what company records would later euphemistically refer to as the Pine Ridge Solution. The date was set for December 23rd, when the family would be working together in their deepest tunnel, and the winter weather would delay any rescue efforts. Samuel Briggs arrived in Pine Ridge 3 days before the planned accident, establishing himself at the town's only boarding house under the pretense of surveying potential railroad routes through the mountains. His presence barely registered with local residents who had grown accustomed to strangers passing through as coal fever gripped the region. Briggs used these days to conduct final reconnaissance of the Kellerman mine, timing the family's daily routines and identifying the optimal location for his deadly work. He had brought with him several sticks of dynamite, ostensibly for clearing railroad routes, along with the tools and knowledge necessary to create what would appear to be a natural cave-in caused by structural weakness in the mine. Heinrich, meanwhile, was experiencing a growing sense of unease that he couldn't quite explain. Martha noticed her husband checking and rechecking the mine's wooden support beams, muttering in German about unsafe conditions that had never concerned him before. On the evening of December 21st, Heinrich confided to his wife that he had been having disturbing dreams about the mine collapsing. Dreams so vivid they felt like warnings. Martha, a practical woman not given to superstition, nevertheless encouraged Heinrich to trust his instincts. They discussed the possibility of taking a brief holiday, perhaps visiting Martha's sister in Nashville until after the new year. But the mine was producing exceptional yields during the winter months, and the income was crucial for their plans to expand operations in the spring. Heinrich decided they would work 2 more days, then close the mine for Christmas week. This decision, overheard by young Johann at the dinner table, would prove fatally convenient for Samuel Briggs, who had been struggling with the timing of his planned sabotage. The boy, proud of his family's success and eager to impress the other children in Pine Ridge, mentioned their Christmas mining plans while playing in the town square the next morning, a conversation Briggs observed from across the street. On December 22nd, Briggs made his final preparations. Under cover of darkness, he approached the Kellerman mine and carefully placed charges at strategic points along the main tunnel support structure. The dynamite was positioned to create a cascading collapse that would bury the main working area under tons of rock and debris, making rescue impossible and body recovery unlikely. To the untrained eye, it would appear that structural flaws in the mine had finally given way under the weight of the mountain above. The most chilling aspect of Briggs's plan was its attention to detail. He had studied mining accidents throughout Appalachia and knew exactly how to create a collapse pattern consistent with natural causes. He even prepared a detailed report for local authorities, explaining the geological factors that made such accidents inevitable in hastily excavated immigrant-owned mines. As the sun set on December 22, 1855, the Kellerman family gathered for what would be their final dinner together. Heinrich spoke proudly of the exceptional coal they had extracted that week, joking with Martha about the fine Christmas presents they would be able to afford their children. Young Wilhelm chatted excitedly about the new mining cart Heinrich had promised to build him, while Maria helped her mother prepare special Christmas bread from their homeland recipe. None of them could have imagined that less than 12 hours later they would all be dead, victims of America's first corporate-sponsored mass murder, a crime that would remain hidden for 34 years. December 23, 1855, dawned gray and bitter cold, with a sharp wind cutting through the Kentucky mountains that promised snow before nightfall. The Kellerman family rose before sunrise, as was their custom during the productive winter months. Martha packed their lunch of bread, cheese, and coffee while Heinrich checked his mining equipment by lamplight. The children dressed quickly in the frigid cabin, their breath visible in the morning air as they prepared for another day of family work in their coal mine. Samuel Briggs watched from a concealed position nearly a 4-mile away, using field glasses to observe the family's morning routine. He had positioned himself on a ridge that provided clear sight lines to both the mine entrance and the access road, ensuring he could monitor the timing of his trap while maintaining distance from the coming explosion. His pocket watch showed 6:47 a.m. when Heinrich lit the first lantern and led his family into the tunnel that would become their tomb. Inside the mine, the Kellermans worked with the efficiency born of months of practice. Heinrich and Johann focused on the deepest section of the main tunnel where the coal vein was richest and most accessible. Martha Maria sorted and loaded the coal into wooden carts while young Wilhelm helped by carrying smaller pieces and keeping the lanterns properly positioned. Baby Elizabeth played nearby, watched carefully by her older sisters in the relative warmth of the underground chamber. What the family didn't know was that Briggs had calculated his explosive charges to detonate at precisely 10:15 a.m., when the family would be deepest in the mine and furthest from any possible escape route. The timing was crucial. Too early and the family might not yet be in the fatal position. Too late and they might have already begun their midday break near the entrance. Briggs had observed their routine for days and knew that 10:15 found them consistently in the mine's most vulnerable location. At 9:30 a.m., an unexpected complication arose that nearly derailed Briggs's murderous plan. Thomas Hartley, a neighboring farmer, approached the mine entrance to speak with Heinrich about purchasing coal for his own family's winter needs. Briggs watched in growing alarm as Hartley called out and began walking toward the tunnel opening. If Hartley entered the mine or lingered near the entrance, he would either become an unintended victim or a potential witness who could complicate the cover story. From his hiding place, Briggs could hear Hartley calling Heinrich's name, his voice echoing into the tunnel depths. For several agonizing minutes, it appeared the farmer might enter the mine to find the family. Briggs fingered the pistol in his coat, prepared to eliminate this unexpected witness if necessary, but ultimately Hartley decided against entering the unfamiliar tunnel. After calling out several more times without response, the Kellermans were too deep in the mine to hear him clearly. Hartley left a brief note at the entrance and departed. The note, which would later become crucial evidence, read, "Henrik Thomas Hartley stopped by at 9:45 a.m. About winter coal, will return this afternoon." The simple message would prove that the family was alive and working normally just 30 minutes before the catastrophic collapse, contradicting later claims that structural problems had been developing over time. At exactly 10:15 a.m., Samuel Briggs pressed the plunger on his makeshift detonator, sending electrical current through copper wires he had carefully concealed along the forest floor to his strategically placed charges. The explosion that followed could be heard for miles, a rumbling boom that shook windows in Pine Ridge and sent flocks of birds fleeing from the surrounding mountains. The collapse was as devastating as Briggs had planned. The main tunnel caved in along a 200-foot section, bringing down thousands of tons of rock and sealing the deeper chambers where the Kellerman family had been working. Secondary collapses continued for nearly an hour, ensuring that any possible survivors would be buried beyond hope of rescue. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Kentucky's coal country intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this tale of corporate murder and buried secrets. From his observation point, Briggs watched the dust cloud rise from the destroyed mine with cold satisfaction. Phase 1 of the Cumberland Coal and Rail Company's Pine Ridge solution was complete. Now came the more delicate work of managing the aftermath and ensuring that the truth of what had happened would remain buried as thoroughly as the Kellerman family themselves. The news of the mine collapse reached Pine Ridge within hours, carried by the thunderous sound of the explosion and the towering dust cloud that rose above the Kellerman property. Local residents, led by Thomas Hartley, whose afternoon visit had been forestalled by the tragedy, rushed to the scene to find the mine entrance completely sealed by massive boulders and debris. Samuel Briggs arrived at the disaster site within 30 minutes, having circled around through the forest to approach from the town direction. His performance as a concerned surveyor was masterful, expressing appropriate shock while subtly discouraging rescue attempts that might reveal evidence of his sabotage. When Hartley mentioned finding his note at the entrance, Briggs was quick to point out that such notes often blew around in the mountain winds, making timing estimates unreliable. The improvised rescue effort that followed was both heroic and heartbreaking. Men from across Harlan County abandoned their Christmas preparations to dig frantically through tons of rock and timber, their hands bleeding in the December cold as they worked by torchlight. Reverend Isaac Thornberry led prayers while the women of Pine Ridge provided hot coffee and food for the exhausted rescuers. Children watched wide-eyed from a safe distance, understanding instinctively that something terrible had happened to the nice German family who always smiled and waved when they passed through town. Thomas Hartley, consumed by guilt over his timing, worked with desperate intensity. He convinced himself that if he had entered the mine that morning, he might have warned the family of some structural weakness he could have observed. Briggs carefully fed this guilt, suggesting that amateur miners like the Kellermans often ignored warning signs that experienced men would recognize. The psychological manipulation was as calculated as the physical destruction. Briggs understood that survivors' guilt would make witnesses more likely to accept his version of events. On the second day of rescue efforts, a breakthrough seemed possible when diggers reached what appeared to be an air pocket in the debris field. Excited shouts echoed across the mountainside as men called down into the darkness, listening desperately for any response from below. For several hours, hope surged through the community as rescue teams worked to widen the opening. But when they finally broke through, they found only an empty cavity created by the way the rocks had fallen. No sign of the Kellerman family, no indication that anyone had survived the initial collapse. Briggs watched these developments with growing anxiety. The air pocket was dangerously close to one of his explosive placement sites, and he feared that continued excavation might reveal fragments of dynamite or the distinctive blast patterns that would expose his sabotage. Working carefully, he convinced the rescue leaders that the cavity's instability made further digging too dangerous. When several men argued for continuing despite the risk, Briggs arranged for a small controlled collapse that sealed the opening while appearing to vindicate his warnings about structural instability. The psychological toll on the rescuers was immense. These were neighbors, men who had shared meals with Heinrich and watched his children grow. Jan Kellerman had helped several of them with their own small mining ventures, sharing his father's technical knowledge freely. Young Maria had taught their daughters German songs, while Wilhelm had become a favorite playmate of the local boys. The thought of these familiar faces buried under tons of rock drove the men to exhaustion and beyond. Dr. Elias Crawford, Pine Ridge's only physician, found himself treating more than physical injuries as the rescue effort continued. Men broke down weeping as they worked, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the tragedy and their inability to help. Women gathered in the church to pray continuously, their voices rising and falling in German hymns that Martha Kellerman had taught them. The entire community seemed to be mourning not just the loss of 5 lives, but the death of innocents, the realization that their mountain sanctuary could harbor such devastating tragedy. On Christmas Eve, exactly 24 hours after the explosion, Reverend Thornberry made the painful decision to call off the rescue effort. The risk to additional lives had become too great, and even the most optimistic assessments suggested that survival was impossible after so much time under such massive debris. The decision sparked angry arguments among the rescuers, with some accusing others of giving up too easily. Briggs skillfully exploited these divisions, positioning himself as the voice of painful but necessary reason. The improvised memorial service held at the sealed mine entrance on Christmas morning was one of the most heartbreaking scenes in Pine Ridge's history. Nearly every resident of the community gathered in the bitter cold, singing hymns in both English and German, while children placed wild flowers on the rocky debris. Heinrich's mining tools retrieved from outside the tunnel were arranged as a makeshift shrine. Martha's sewing basket found in their cabin was filled with letters from neighbors expressing their grief and admiration for the family's courage and kindness. Samuel Briggs participated in the memorial with apparent sincerity, even contributing to the collection being taken up for a proper monument. Internally, he felt a mixture of relief and professional satisfaction. The operation had proceeded exactly as planned, with no evidence of sabotage discovered and community sentiment firmly behind the accident theory. Yet, he also found himself unexpectedly affected by the genuine grief surrounding him, particularly when little Sarah Hartley, Thomas's 6-year-old daughter, asked her father why God had taken away her friend Wilhelm right before Christmas. The official investigation conducted by Harlan County Sheriff Marcus Webb began on December 27th with what appeared to be thorough documentation of the scene. Sheriff Webb, whose election campaign had been generously supported by Cumberland Coal and Rail Company donations, spent 2 full days examining the collapse site and interviewing witnesses. His methodology appeared professional and comprehensive, creating detailed sketches of the debris field and carefully recording testimony from rescue workers and community members. What Sheriff Webb didn't investigate, and what Briggs had counted on, was the suspicious timing and scale of the disaster. No geological survey was conducted to determine whether the rock formations were actually unstable enough to cause such a massive collapse. No inquiry was made into the mathematical improbability of an entire family being trapped simultaneously in the deepest, most dangerous part of their mine. Most critically, no explosives expert was consulted to examine the debris pattern for signs of artificial detonation. Briggs provided Sheriff Webb with what appeared to be expert testimony about mining dangers and structural inadequacies. He produced technical drawings and geological surveys fabricated in Cumberland Coal and Rail Company offices that purported to show dangerous fault lines running directly through the Kellerman property. His presentation was so convincing that Sheriff Webb incorporated entire passages from Briggs's expert analysis into his official report, lending the document an authority it didn't deserve. The preliminary report filed on December 30th, 1855, concluded that the collapse had been caused by structural inadequacies common to hastily excavated mining operations conducted without proper engineering oversight or geological assessment. The report specifically noted that immigrant miners, while hardworking and well-intentioned, often lacked the technical knowledge necessary to recognize dangerous mining conditions. This conclusion, while appearing sympathetic to the victims, actually served to absolve anyone of responsibility for the tragedy while reinforcing dangerous stereotypes about immigrant competence. Thomas Hartley emerged as the most persistent questioner of the official findings. His note, time-stamped at 9:45 a.m., on the morning of the collapse, provided inconvenient evidence that the mine had been structurally sound just 30 minutes before the explosion. Hartley also pointed out that Heinrich Kellerman had demonstrated considerable mining expertise, successfully operating his tunnel for nearly a year without any structural problems. When Hartley pressed Sheriff Webb to explain why an experienced miner would suddenly make fatal errors in judgment, he was told that even experts could be deceived by hidden geological weaknesses. Briggs recognized Hartley as a potential threat to his cover story and began a careful campaign of social undermining. He spread subtle suggestions that Hartley's guilt over the timing of his visit was affecting his judgment, causing him to see conspiracies where none existed. He pointed out that Hartley was not himself a mining expert and therefore couldn't accurately assess the structural conditions he claimed to have observed. Most effectively, Breed suggested that Hartley's persistent questioning was preventing the community from healing and moving forward after their tragedy. The social pressure eventually forced Hartley to moderate his public questioning, though he never stopped believing that something was fundamentally wrong with the official explanation. In his personal diary, preserved by his family for generations, Hartley wrote, "There was nothing unstable about Heinrich's mind that morning. The supports were solid, the air was clear, and the tunnel showed no signs of stress. I may not be a mining engineer, but I know what I saw. Someone is lying about what happened to that family, and someday the truth will come out." The final masterstroke of the cover-up came in January 1856, when Jeremiah Whitlock himself arrived in Pine Ridge to express his company's condolences and make what appeared to be a generous offer to the community. Cumberland Coal and Rail would purchase the Kellerman property from Harlan County, which had inherited it due to the family's intestate deaths, and donate a substantial sum for a memorial to the victims. The company would also provide employment for local men in their expanded mining operations, bringing prosperity to Pine Ridge in the wake of tragedy. Whitlock's arrival was orchestrated as a masterpiece of public relations and emotional manipulation. He came not in a fancy carriage that would emphasize class differences, but on horseback like a common man. He stayed not at the boarding house, but accepted the hospitality of local families, sharing their simple meals and listening to their stories about the Kellerman family. His expressions of grief appeared genuine, and his promises of economic opportunity offered hope to a community struggling with both mourning and winter hardship. The community meeting where Whitlock presented his proposal was held in the Pine Ridge Church with nearly every adult resident in attendance. Whitlock spoke movingly about the tragedy, describing Heinrich Kellerman as a symbol of American opportunity and immigrant determination. He promised that Cumberland Coal and Rail would honor the family's memory by developing their discovery responsibly, ensuring that their sacrifice would benefit the entire community. The memorial fund, he proposed, would not only create a proper monument, but also establish a scholarship for local children to receive mining education, preventing future tragedies through better technical knowledge. The economic incentives Whitlock offered were substantial enough to overcome any lingering doubts about his company's motives. Pine Ridge was an isolated community with limited opportunities for steady employment, and the promise of well-paying mining jobs for local men represented a transformation of their economic prospects. Whitlock carefully emphasized that his company's advanced mining techniques and professional supervision would eliminate the dangers that had claimed the Kellerman family, turning their tragedy into a catalyst for progress and safety. Opposition to Whitlock's proposal came primarily from Thomas Hartley and a few other residents who felt uncomfortable with the speed and convenience of the arrangement. Hartley argued that accepting Cumberland Coal and Rail's offer so quickly after the tragedy felt like profiting from the Kellerman's deaths. He suggested waiting at least a year to allow proper investigation and reflection before making such momentous decisions. His concerns were echoed by Reverend Thornberry, who worried that rapid commercial development might dishonor the memory of the victims. Whitlock countered these objections with a combination of practical arguments and emotional appeals. He pointed out that winter was harsh and employment scarce, making delay potentially disastrous for families already struggling to survive. He suggested that honoring the Kellerman's memory was best accomplished not through prolonged mourning, but through ensuring that their discovery would benefit the community they had loved. Most persuasively, he argued that professional mining development would make the area safer for everyone, preventing similar tragedies through proper engineering and safety procedures. The vote, taken after 3 hours of sometimes heated discussion, favored accepting Whitlock's proposal by a margin of 47 to 12. The minority who voted against the deal did so quietly, unwilling to appear obstructionist in the face of their neighbors' economic needs. Thomas Hartley cast one of the dissenting votes, but publicly accepted the community's decision, stating that he hoped he was wrong about his suspicions and that some good might indeed come from the tragedy. Within 6 months, Cumberland Coal and Rail had constructed a large-scale mining operation on the former Kellerman property, complete with professional engineering supervision, modern safety equipment, and standardized extraction procedures. The company's geological surveys, conducted with great fanfare and publicity, revealed the extraordinary richness of the coal vein that Heinrich had discovered, a coincidence that no one in Pine Ridge found suspicious given Whitlock's careful presentation of the development as honoring the family's legacy. The employment opportunities materialized exactly as promised, with local men earning wages that transformed their families' living standards. New houses were built, children received better education, and Pine Ridge evolved from an isolated mountain community to a prosperous mining town. The success of the operation seemed to vindicate Whitlock's promises and silence the last whispers of doubt about the circumstances surrounding the Kellerman tragedy. Samuel Briggs remained in the area for several months, ostensibly to oversee the railroad surveying that had been his original cover story. His presence provided continuity and reassurance as the community adapted to its new relationship with Cumberland Coal and Rail. He was careful to maintain his image as an impartial expert who would help the community understand their tragedy and move forward constructively. When he finally departed Pine Ridge in the summer of 1856, he was thanked publicly for his assistance during their time of crisis. By 1857, the Kellerman family had been largely forgotten, except as a cautionary tale about the dangers of amateur mining and the importance of professional supervision. Their names appeared on a modest but dignified stone memorial in Pinergees Cemetery, listing them as victims of an industrial accident. The memorial, funded jointly by Cumberland Coal and Rail Company and community donations, bore an inscription that would later prove darkly ironic in memory of the Kellerman family taken by the mountain they loved. Their sacrifice paved the way for progress and prosperity. The inscription reflected the community's genuine desire to find meaning in tragedy, but it also served Cumberland Coal and Rail's interests by reinforcing the narrative that the family's deaths had been a necessary sacrifice for economic development. The word sacrifice was particularly insidious, suggesting a voluntary offering rather than a calculated murder, while progress and prosperity positioned their deaths as a foundation for community advancement rather than corporate profit. For 33 years, this version of events remained unquestioned and largely unexamined. The Kellerman case became a footnote in Kentucky's mining history, one of dozens of similar tragedies that marked the dangerous early days of coal extraction in Appalachia. Mining safety advocates occasionally cited the case as an example of why professional oversight was essential, but none questioned whether the family's deaths had been preventable through means other than better engineering. Samuel Briggs returned to Louisville and was quietly promoted within the Cumberland Coal and Rail organization, where a success in resolving the Pine Ridge situation earned him a reputation for handling the company's most sensitive problems. Over the following decades, he applied similar techniques to eliminate other obstacles to Cumberland's expansion, though none required measures as extreme as those used against the Kellermans. His methods evolved to rely more heavily on legal manipulation and financial pressure, as the Kellerman operation had demonstrated both the effectiveness and the risks of more direct action. Jeremiah Whitlock became one of Kentucky's most prominent and respected businessmen, using the profits from the Kellerman coal vein to expand Cumberland Coal and Rail into one of the largest mining operations in the southeastern United States. He was celebrated as a visionary industrialist who had brought prosperity to previously isolated mountain communities, and his company's safety record, carefully maintained through professional engineering and worker training programs, became a model for the industry. The irony that Whitlock's reputation for safety and worker welfare was built on the foundation of a mass murder was lost on everyone except a small circle of Cumberland executives who knew the truth about Pine Ridge. These men maintained their silence through a combination of shared guilt, mutual self-interest, and the understanding that revealing the truth would destroy not only their own careers, but the livelihoods of thousands of workers whose families depended on Cumberland's continued success. But secrets like COSMs have a way of working their way to the surface over time, and the truth about the Kellerman family's murder carried within it the seeds of its own eventual revelation. The truth about the Kellerman family's murder began to emerge in the spring of 1889, 34 years after their deaths, through a series of events that even Samuel Briggs couldn't have anticipated. The catalyst was Briggs himself, now 67 years old and dying slowly from the lung disease that had claimed so many men who worked around coal dust their entire lives. As Briggs lay on his deathbed in Louisville's Charity Hospital, he was visited by Father Michael O'Brien, a Catholic priest who ministered to the city's poor and dying. Father O'Brien was an Irish immigrant himself, a man whose own experiences with poverty and discrimination had made him particularly sensitive to the struggles of working families. His reputation for compassion and discretion had made him a trusted confidant for many of Louisville's industrial workers who often carried burdens of guilt and fear related to their employers' questionable practices. What began as a routine last rites visit became something far more extraordinary when Briggs, delirious with fever and racked by guilt that had festered for 3 decades, began confessing to crimes that O'Brien initially dismissed as the ravings of a dying man. The priest had heard many deathbed confessions over his 20-year ministry, and experience had taught him to distinguish between genuine admissions and the phantoms of gold-trodden minds approaching death. But as Briggs spoke, his account became too detailed and consistent to ignore. He described the Kellerman property with perfect accuracy down to the specific types of timber Heinrich had used for tunnel supports and the exact configuration of the mine's ventilation system. He recalled conversations with Jeremiah Whitlock verbatim, including private discussions that had taken place in locked offices with no other witnesses present. Most unsettling of all, Briggs provided specifics about the family's final morning that had never been made public. Their breakfast routine, the children's conversations, Martha's concerns about the weather, details he could only have known through the careful surveillance that had preceded their murder. Father O'Brien found himself listening to a confession unlike any in his experience. Briggs described the technical aspects of his sabotage with the precision of an engineer, explaining how he had calculated explosive placement to create a collapse pattern that would appear natural to investigators. He detailed the psychological manipulation he had used during the rescue effort, the way he had exploited community grief to discourage thorough investigation, and the systematic destruction of evidence that might have revealed his involvement. The most chilling aspect of Briggs's confession was his apparent pride in the technical elegance of his crime, even as he expressed genuine remorse for its human cost. He spoke of the operation as a masterpiece of planning and execution, a perfect murder that had remained undetected for over 3 decades. Yet he also wept as he described watching little Wilhelm Kellerman play in the town square, knowing that the boy would be dead within days. The contradiction between professional satisfaction and human guilt had apparently tormented Briggs for years, contributing to the drinking problem that had accelerated his physical decline. Father O'Brien, bound by the seal of confession, but deeply troubled by what he had heard, faced an extraordinary moral and ethical dilemma. The magnitude of the crime Briggs described, the calculated murder of an entire family for corporate profit, demanded justice even decades after the fact. Yet his sacred obligation to maintain the confidentiality of confession prevented him from directly revealing what he had learned. The priest spent sleepless nights wrestling with the competing demands of his religious duties and his moral outrage. The solution O'Brien eventually devised required careful navigation of both canon law and his own conscience. While he could not reveal the specific contents of Briggs's confession, he could undertake his own investigation into the Kellerman case and arrange for evidence to be discovered through seemingly independent research. This approach would honor the seal of confession while still pursuing justice for the victims, though it would require months of painstaking detective work. Father O'Brien began his investigation by examining public records related to the Kellerman case, starting with newspaper accounts of the mine collapse and the official investigation report filed by Sheriff Webb. What he discovered immediately raised questions about the thoroughness and objectivity of the original inquiry. The sheriff's report relied heavily on technical testimony provided by Samuel Briggs. Yet there was no documentation of Briggs's qualifications or independent verification of his geological assessments. More troubling was the discovery that Sheriff Webb had received substantial financial support from Cumberland Coal and Rail Company during his election campaign, a conflict of interest that should have disqualified him from investigating the case. O'Brien found records showing that Cumberland had been the sheriff's largest single contributor, providing funds that had been crucial to his victory over a more experienced opponent. This financial relationship had never been disclosed during the investigation, despite its obvious relevance to the case's outcome. The priest's investigation led him to seek out surviving witnesses from the 1855 tragedy, a challenging task given the passage of time and the isolation of the mountain community. Many of the original residents had died or moved away, but O'Brien eventually located several elderly individuals who retained clear memories of the events surrounding the mine collapse. Their accounts, when compared with the official record, revealed significant discrepancies that had been overlooked or ignored during the original investigation. Most important was O'Brien's discovery of Thomas Hartley, now 71 years old, and living with his daughter in Lexington. Hartley had never stopped questioning the official explanation for the Kellerman tragedy, and he had preserved extensive documentation of his own observations and concerns. His personal papers included the original note he had left at the mine entrance, detailed descriptions of the tunnel's structural condition on the morning of the collapse, and a chronology of suspicious events that had preceded the tragedy. Hartley's documentation provided Father O'Brien with crucial corroboration for elements of Briggs's deathbed confession. The old farmer's notes described strangers watching the Kellerman property in the weeks before the collapse, strangers whose presence had seemed insignificant at the time but took on sinister meaning in light of Briggs's admissions. Hartley had also documented the economic pressure and legal harassment that the family had faced, pressure that the official investigation had dismissed as irrelevant to the mining accident. Perhaps most significantly, Hartley had preserved the original surveyor's reports that contradicted the official story about geological instability in the Kellerman mine. These reports, commissioned by Heinrich Kellerman himself as part of his property purchase, showed stable rock formations and no indication of the fault lines that Briggs had later claimed were responsible for the collapse. The reports had been filed with the county clerk's office, but had somehow been omitted from Sheriff Webb's investigation, an oversight that now appeared deliberately orchestrated. Armed with this mounting evidence, Father O'Brien faced the challenge of bringing it to public attention without revealing the source of his investigation. His solution was to approach Daniel Morrison, a crusading journalist with a Louisville Courier-Journal who had built a reputation investigating corruption in Kentucky's coal industry. Morrison had recently published a series of articles exposing unsafe working conditions and financial irregularities at several mining companies, making him a natural ally for O'Brien's purposes. O'Brien's approach to Morrison was carefully orchestrated to appear coincidental. The priest arranged to accidentally encounter the journalist at a public meeting about mining safety, where he casually mentioned his interest in historical mining accidents and his discovery of some interesting documents related to the old Kellerman case. When Morrison expressed professional curiosity, O'Brien offered to share his research, presenting it as an academic exercise rather than a criminal investigation. Morrison's journalistic instincts were immediately aroused by the inconsistencies and gaps in the official record that O'Brien had uncovered. The reporter recognized the hallmarks of a cover-up and began his own investigation, using his professional resources and contacts to dig deeper into the Cumberland Coal and Rail Company's involvement in the case. Morrison's investigation soon expanded beyond the Kellerman tragedy to examine the company's broader pattern of acquiring mineral rights through questionable means. The breakthrough in Morrison's investigation came when he located financial records showing unusual payments made by Cumberland Coal and Rail to Samuel Briggs in late 1855, payments that corresponded exactly with the timeline of the mine collapse. These payments, disguised as consulting fees for geological survey work, were far larger than typical surveying contracts and had no accompanying documentation to justify their size. When Morrison traced Briggs's subsequent career with Cumberland, he found a pattern of similar payments coinciding with the company's acquisition of other disputed properties. Morrison also discovered that Jeremiah Whitlock had personally visited Pine Ridge in the weeks following the Kellerman tragedy. Despite company records claiming he had no direct involvement in the property acquisition, local residents remembered Whitlock's presence clearly, particularly his unusual generosity and his detailed knowledge of the mine's coal reserves, knowledge that would have been impossible to obtain without prior investigation of the property. The final piece of Morrison's puzzle came from an unexpected source. Samuel Briggs's own business records discovered in a trunk left with his landlady after his death. These records, which Briggs had apparently been too ill to destroy, included detailed maps of the Kellerman property, explosives, purchase receipts, and most damning of all, a hand-drawn diagram showing optimal placement points for creating a natural-appearing mine collapse. The diagram matched the actual debris pattern at the Kellerman site with chilling precision. Morrison's expose, published as a 4-part series in the Louisville Courier-Journal beginning September 15, 1889, sent shockwaves through Kentucky's business and political communities. The headline of the first article read, "Murder in the Mines. Company Conspiracy Behind Kellerman Family Deaths Exposed After 34 Years." The series methodically dismantled the official accident narrative, revealing the systematic campaign of intimidation, the fabricated geological evidence, and the financial incentives that had motivated the crime. The public reaction was swift and furious, exceeding even Morrison's expectations for the impact of his investigation. Cumberland Coal and Rail Company found itself facing criminal investigations by both state and federal authorities, civil lawsuits from the families of other mining accident victims, and a boycott of their coal that spread across the Ohio Valley and beyond. The company's stock price collapsed as investors fled, and several major contracts were canceled by customers who refused to be associated with the scandal. Jeremiah Whitlock, now 73 years old and one of Kentucky's most prominent businessmen, saw his reputation and empire destroyed virtually overnight. The man who had been celebrated as a visionary industrialist and philanthropist was suddenly exposed as the architect of multiple murders and the beneficiary of decades of stolen wealth. His denials of involvement in the Kellerman case lacked credibility given the overwhelming documentary evidence, and his health began to fail rapidly under the stress of public disgrace and legal scrutiny. The personal toll on Whitlock was evident to all who encountered him during his final weeks. Friends and business associates described a man who had aged years in a matter of days, his previous confidence replaced by paranoid fear and obsessive concern about his legacy. He spent hours with lawyers, attempting to craft legal strategies that might minimize his criminal exposure, but the evidence against him was too comprehensive and damaging to overcome through conventional defense tactics. Whitlock's death from a heart attack just 3 weeks after Morrison's first article was published shocked even his harshest critics. While some dismissed it as coincidental, others suggested that the shame and stress of his exposed crimes had literally killed him. His funeral, once planned as a grand celebration of industrial achievement, became instead a sparsely attended affair marked by protesters who gathered outside the church carrying signs demanding justice for the Kellerman family and other victims of corporate violence. The legal aftermath of the Morrison expose proved complicated by the passage of time and the death of key participants. Most of the principal conspirators were dead, crucial evidence had been destroyed or lost, and witnesses had scattered across the country or died of old age. However, the state of Kentucky did file posthumous criminal charges against Samuel Briggs and opened formal investigations into Cumberland Coal and Rail's business practices throughout its corporate history. More importantly for the cause of justice, the Kellerman case became a rallying point for labor reformers and mining safety advocates throughout Appalachia and beyond. The case was cited extensively during congressional hearings on mining safety regulations, and it provided powerful ammunition for activists, arguing that corporate power needed to be constrained by stronger government oversight and criminal penalties for executive misconduct. The exposure of the Kellerman murders also triggered a wave of reinvestigations into other suspicious mining accidents throughout Kentucky and surrounding states. Families who had long harbored doubts about official explanations for industrial tragedies found new courage to challenge corporate narratives and demand accountability. Several additional cases of corporate-sponsored violence were uncovered, though none matched the Kellerman case for sheer audacity and comprehensive documentation. Cumberland Co. and Rail Company itself did not survive the scandal. Facing massive legal liabilities and complete loss of public confidence, the corporation was forced into bankruptcy within 6 months of Morrison's expose. Its assets were eventually acquired by competitors and broken up, with the Kellerman mine itself being sold to a worker-owned cooperative that operated it until the coal seam was finally exhausted in the early 20th century. The Kellerman property itself underwent a transformation that Heinrich would have found bitterly ironic, yet ultimately satisfying. The rich coal vein that he had discovered continued to produce for decades, but under the cooperative ownership model, the profits were shared among the workers rather than concentrated in corporate hands. The cooperative also established safety standards that far exceeded industry norms, ensuring that no other families would suffer the Kellerman's fate through preventable accidents or deliberate violence. Thomas Hartley lived to see his decades-long quest for justice vindicated by Morrison's investigation. The old farmer, now regarded as a hero for his persistent questioning of official narratives, spent his remaining years speaking to mining communities about the importance of holding corporations accountable for their actions. His personal documentation of the Kellerman case became part of the Kentucky State Archives, preserving for future generations a detailed record of how ordinary citizens could challenge powerful interests through careful observation and unwavering commitment to truth. Father Michael O'Brien continued his ministry among Louisville's working poor, but the Kellerman case marked him profoundly and shaped his subsequent advocacy for social justice causes. He never publicly revealed his role in exposing the murders, maintaining the confidential nature of his investigation until his own death decades later. However, his private papers, discovered after his death, documented his careful navigation of the ethical challenges posed by Briggs's confession and his innovative approach to pursuing justice while honoring religious obligations. The broader impact of the Kellerman case extended far beyond Kentucky's coal fields. The scandal was covered extensively by newspapers throughout the United States and became a symbol of the excesses and moral failures of America's Gilded Age capitalism. Labor leaders and social reformers cited the case as evidence that corporate power posed fundamental threats to democratic values and individual rights, arguments that would gain increasing political support in the progressive era, reforms of the early 20th century. In 1955, exactly 100 years after the family's murder, the mine was finally exhausted and abandoned after a century of production that had generated millions of dollars in wealth. Local historians, working with descendants of Pioneer Ridge families and labor organizations, established a proper memorial at the site, not to industrial accident victims, but to the Kellerman family, murdered for the crime of standing in the way of corporate greed and representing the promise of economic independence that America offered to its immigrants. The memorial, constructed from the same limestone that Heinrich had quarried from his property, bears an inscription that tells the true story of the family's fate. Heinrich, Martha, Johann, Maria, Wilhelm, and Elizabeth Kellerman, German immigrants who came to America seeking opportunity and found instead that even in the land of the free, some lives were considered expendable when measured against corporate profits. Murdered. December 23, 1855, for the crime of refusing to surrender their dreams to industrial greed. Today, the overgrown entrance to the old mine serves as a stark reminder of America's industrial past and the human cost of unchecked capitalism. The site has become a destination for historians, labor activists, and tourists interested in the hidden stories of American economic development. Educational programs conducted at the memorial help visitors understand how the Kellerman tragedy reflected broader patterns of corporate violence and worker exploitation that shaped the nation's industrial transformation. The memorial also includes a museum displaying artifacts from the investigation that exposed the murders. Morrison's original articles, Father O'Brien's research notes, Thomas Hartley's documentation, and even some of Samuel Briggs's planning materials recovered after his death. These exhibits help visitors understand not only what happened to the Kellerman family, but how the truth was eventually uncovered through the courage and persistence of individuals who refused to accept official lies. Perhaps most importantly, the Kellerman case continues to serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of concentrated corporate power and the importance of independent journalism, community activism, and moral courage in holding powerful institutions accountable. The story has been taught in schools throughout Kentucky and beyond as an example of how ordinary citizens can challenge injustice and eventually prevail against seemingly insurmountable odds. The case also illustrates the long arc of historical justice, how crimes that seem perfectly concealed can eventually be exposed through the convergence of human conscience, documentary evidence, and changing social attitudes that make previously acceptable behavior suddenly unthinkable. The 34-year delay between the murders and their exposure demonstrated both the power of corporate influence to suppress truth and the ultimate futility of attempting to bury moral crimes beneath layers of official narrative and social complicity. The Kellerman case reveals a disturbing truth about America's Gilded Age. Behind the celebrated stories of industrial progress and economic expansion lay countless hidden tragedies, families destroyed not by accident or fate, but by the calculated cruelty of men who valued coal more than human life. Yet it also demonstrates the redemptive power of truth-telling and the possibility that justice, however delayed, can eventually prevail when individuals of conscience refuse to let crimes remain buried beneath official lies and corporate propaganda. What do you think of this story? Do you believe justice was ever truly served for the Kellerman family? Or does the 34-year delay represent a fundamental failure of American institutions to protect vulnerable citizens from corporate violence? How many other similar crimes might remain buried beneath the official histories of America's industrial development? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about this dark chapter of American capitalism. If you enjoyed this exploration of hidden history and want more stories that expose the forgotten crimes behind America's economic progress, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves historical mysteries that reveal uncomfortable truths about our past. See you in the next video.